Reports from behind the heavily guarded gates of Windsor Castle indicate an unprecedented shift in royal authority, an internal takeover executed not through constitutional law, but through an indelible act of legacy and love. What transpired within the private quarters of the enclave was nothing short of a seismic overthrow of the old palace order. The senior line of the House of Windsor had been summoned under the impression of a routine briefing regarding future duties. Instead, they walked into a calculated reckoning decades in the making. Behind double-locked oak doors, where centuries of palace secrets are kept buried beneath protocol, Prince William delivered a strike to the foundation of the monarchy, forever altering the balance of power between the reigning sovereign and the future king. The room was heavy with a suffocating, deliberate silence. King Charles sat framed by the towering windows of the private sitting room, flanked by Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, and a select inner circle of high-ranking household courtiers. None of them had been prepared for what the Prince of Wales was about to reveal. In his hands, William held a velvet-lined case housing an unregistered relic, a private, historic ceremonial crown connected directly to his late mother, Princess Diana, and her most guarded private hopes for her eldest son's destiny. Moving with total disregard for royal permission, William stepped toward Catherine. Without seeking the king's approval or consulting constitutional advisors, he raised the crown above his wife's head and declared before the stunned room that Diana's final, unfulfilled wish would at last be honored. As the historic piece rested upon Catherine's head, the atmosphere inside the chamber fractured. Catherine did not react with the triumph of a monarch stepping into power. Her shoulders trembled beneath the staggering weight of a blessing cast from beyond the grave. She felt the ghost of a mother-in-law she had never met, whose tragic memory still haunted the corridors of the institution. Across the room, King Charles's hands tightened around the carved armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned bone white. He lowered his eyes, unable to mask the sudden wave of regret washing across his face. He understood instantly that his son had executed a masterstroke of emotional warfare. William had transformed Diana's memory from a quiet ghost into a living, authoritative force inside the modern monarchy, a force the king could neither control nor dismiss. Queen Camilla remained rigid, her expression darkening as the prince reached into his coat to produce a folded, age-yellowed document. It was a secret family testimony, preserved alongside the crown, wherein Diana had written explicit instructions for her son's future. She had decreed that the woman who stood beside William must possess extraordinary courage, fierce loyalty, and the emotional strength required to shield him from the cold, isolating machinery of royal life. The sudden realization hit Camilla like a physical blow. Key figures within the room had known of these secret writings for years, keeping them hidden from the queen consort while the groundwork for this moment was quietly laid. The roots of this quiet rebellion did not originate within the manicured grounds of Windsor, but years earlier behind the heavy library doors of Althorpe Estate. Surrounded by archived Spencer family records untouched by palace censors, William had been handed a sealed envelope bearing his mother's distinctive handwriting. The instructions were absolute. It was to be opened only when he knew without a shadow of a doubt whom he could trust. That night, after witnessing Catherine's effortless, unscripted compassion toward a grieving child during a private memorial, William broke the seal. Diana's written words were not merely a mother's tender reflection. They were a prophetic warning, urging her son never to let the crown strip away his humanity or repeat the systemic isolation that had destroyed her. Yet, as William unfolded the final page of the manuscript before his father, the tribute turned into a terrifying confrontation. The document contained a direct assessment of Charles's past choices after his first marriage collapsed. Outside the room, the shadowy machinery of the palace was already moving. Camilla leaned close to a senior courtier near the doorway, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper as she questioned the legal standing of the unsanctioned crown. Scheming behind the scenes, palace advisors had already drafted internal proposals to restrict Catherine's independent decision-making power, attempting to trap her in the very same bureaucratic cage that had once crushed Diana. But as father and son locked eyes across the room, it became brutally clear that the quiet submission of the past was over. The silence within the Windsor drawing room hardened into an oppressive physical weight that seemed to press the breath from every throat. William stood motionless, the folded sheets of his mother's private testament held between his fingers, his gaze locked onto the king. The passage he had just read, referencing the emotional isolation Diana suffered after her marriage collapsed, hung in the air like an unexploded charge. King Charles did not move, but the sudden twitch of his jaw betrayed the depth of the strike. Beside him, Queen Camilla sat unnaturally still, her eyes darting toward the shadows near the doorway where senior household officials stood frozen in alarm. The illusion of a unified royal house, meticulously constructed over decades of media management and strategic silence, had dissolved in a single, devastating minute. Behind the polished facade of courtly decorum, a covert counterstrike was already underway. For months, whispers had circulated through palace corridors regarding an internal administrative proposal, a secret memorandum drafted with the subtle encouragement of Camilla's closest advisors. The document was designed to systematically strip Catherine of her independent decision-making authority, establishing a vetting committee of senior courtiers who would oversee every public engagement, charitable initiative, and personal statement she attempted to make. It was a cold, institutional strategy aimed at containing her rising public influence and neutralizing any lingering shadow of the Spencer legacy. But William had uncovered the hidden dossier before it could be quietly ratified. By bringing Diana's historic crown out of the archives, he had not merely staged an emotional family tribute. He had launched a preemptive strike against an internal palace coup meant to reduce his wife to a managed figurehead. Before the gathering could fracture into open hostility, Princess Anne stepped forward. With the iron authority that had long made her the unyielding spine of the royal house, she walked to the heavy double doors, turned the brass key, and threw the bolt shut. Nobody would leave. No courtiers would leak sanitized versions to the press, and no handlers would script a retreat for the king. Returning to the center of the room, Anne produced a leather folder from her personal archive. Inside lay a series of long-preserved letters exchanged between herself and Diana during the monarchy's darkest hours. Anne looked directly at her brother, confirming what the king had spent years trying to deny. Diana had explicitly warned that the institution would one day attempt to isolate and control William's future bride. The Princess Royal's words stripped away Charles's ability to dismiss his son's action as emotional instability. The warning was not a newly invented grievance. It was a documented historical truth, corroborated by the one person whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. Driven into a corner by his sister's testimony and the undeniable initials engraved inside the inner rim of the crown, King Charles demanded a private conference. Father and son withdrew into the solemn sanctuary of the royal library, leaving Catherine, Camilla, and Anne in the heavy silence of the outer hall. Behind the soundproof mahogany doors, the battle for the soul of the monarchy reached its fever pitch. Charles, desperate to preserve his sovereign authority, offered a pragmatic, brutal compromise. He agreed to sanction the ceremonial crown as a private tribute within the family, but on one non-negotiable condition. All official references to Diana's written wish must be erased from the record. Her name was to be sanitized from the story, reducing the event to a nameless gesture. The king argued that allowing a deceased princess to dictate royal protocol would permanently weaken the reigning monarch, setting a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the sovereign succession. Yet, when the library doors reopened, it became clear that Charles had miscalculated the force confronting him. William did not yield to the legalistic logic of the state. He returned to Catherine's side, his resolve hardened. But it was Catherine herself who broke the deadlock. Refusing to let her image be used as an instrument of vengeance against a wounded father, she looked directly into William's eyes and issued her own uncompromising decree. She would not accept a crown forged out of bitterness or secret retaliation. If this moment was to have any true authority, Charles himself would have to place the historic piece into William's hands, publicly acknowledging Diana's enduring role in shaping the future of the house. Catherine's refusal to act as a pawn transformed the struggle from a raw power play into a profound psychological trap for the king. He could either honor the memory of the woman he had once failed, or risk a permanent, catastrophic breach with the son who held the future of the monarchy in his hands. The doors of the inner sanctum remained locked, sealing the key figures inside a chamber heavy with the scent of aged mahogany, rain-dampened silk, and decades of silent grief. The faint glow of brass desk lamps cast deep, shadow-drenched contours across the painted portraits of bygone monarchs, as though history itself was witnessing the collapse of court diplomacy. King Charles stood near the central hearth, his hands trembling behind his back as he stared into the fading embers. When he finally turned, his face was etched with exhaustion, his authority strained to its absolute limit. Across the room stood Prince William, rigid and unyielding, his eyes burning with the solemn resolve of a son executing a long-deferred justice. Between them lay the open velvet case containing Diana's crown, an unsanctioned relic that exposed the fragile fiction of palace harmony. The confrontation reached its peak when William laid a dossier of leaked palace documents onto the table, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative rasp that cut through the silence. "You have spent half a century placing institutional survival before human emotion," the prince declared, stepping into his father's space. "You allowed advisors to isolate my mother, and now your court attempts to quietly clip Catherine's wings through signed administrative decrees. It stops tonight." William delivered his ultimatum without hesitation. "Either you formally revoke this memorandum, strike down the restrictions against my wife, and publicly validate Diana's wish, or I step back from all sovereign duties immediately. You may keep the crown, Your Majesty, but you will govern a broken line with no future." The threat hung in the air like a blade, an unprecedented heir's strike that threatened to shatter the very legitimacy of the reign. Queen Camilla tried to breach the standoff, stepping forward with her hands clutched around her pearl necklace, her voice sharp with suppressed rage. "This is open defiance of the sovereign's will," she asserted, looking frantically to the king. "You cannot allow emotional grievance to dictate the governance of this house. If a monarch yields to threats within his own family, the authority of the state is destroyed." But before her words could take root, Princess Anne stepped into her line of sight, her gaze cold and immovable. "Enough, Camilla," Anne said softly, her tone carrying the iron weight of royal blood. "You came into this house after the damage was done. You do not get to lecture Diana's son on how he protects his family from the very machinery that broke his mother." Camilla recoiled, the color draining from her face, as she realized that her years of quiet influence within the court had crumbled in a single, devastating second. Catherine then stepped between the men, her composure unbroken, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity that commanded the room. She looked directly at King Charles, refusing to allow the moment to devolve into mutual destruction. "Your Majesty," she said, her steady voice echoing off the high paneling, "I did not ask for this crown, nor will I wear it as a weapon used to humiliate a father. But if you force William to bury his mother's memory once more just to defend institutional pride, you reveal that this monarchy values obedience over truth. I will not accept a future built on repeated cruelty." Her words struck deeper than any threat of rebellion. The king stared at Catherine, seeing for the first time not merely a dedicated Princess of Wales, but an indispensable pillar of moral strength, the very guardian Diana had prayed would one day protect her son from the cold isolation of the court. The silence that followed was absolute. King Charles looked from the engraved initials inside Diana's crown to the unwavering eyes of his son. The weight of his own past choices, the silences he had enforced, the warnings he had ignored, the tragic cost of placing protocol over love, seemed to crush his remaining resistance. Slowly, with trembling hands, the king sat at the grand desk. He picked up his signet pen and executed a formal revocation of the court memorandum, effectively dismantling the shadow network that had sought to limit Catherine's independence. Then, taking Diana's crown into his own hands, Charles stood up, stepped toward William, and placed the historic piece into his heir's palms. Tears glistened in the monarch's eyes as the power dynamic shattered and reformed forever. Justice had triumphed over court intrigue, and the reign's true authority had quietly passed to the next generation. When the sun rose over the gray stone battlements of Windsor Castle the following morning, it illuminated a house transformed beyond recognition. The storm had passed, but in its wake lay the quiet, devastating reality of an altered kingdom. The old power structures that had dictated royal life for half a century had not merely bent, they had broken under the weight of an unyielding reckoning. King Charles remained in his private study long past dawn, staring at the revoked decrees and unsigned council papers scattered across his desk. The sovereign was no longer the undisputed master of his court. His formal signature had preserved his relationship with his son, but it had stripped him of the absolute institutional control he had spent a lifetime preparing to exercise. Every clock ticking through the silent corridors seemed to count down the waning authority of a reign that had been fundamentally reshaped not by parliament or law, but by the ghost of the woman the palace had tried for decades to erase. For the losing faction within the palace, the aftermath was a cold, fatalistic exile executed without a single word of public banishment. Queen Camilla walked the long, shadow-draped galleries of Buckingham Palace in absolute isolation, the rustle of her silk gown echoing through halls where her influence had once been absolute. The network of senior courtiers who had built their careers on managing the monarch found their access abruptly severed. Internal memoranda drafted by her secretarial team were returned unread, stamped with the concise, chilling insignia of the Prince of Wales. The scheming advisors who had sought to cage Catherine were quietly reassigned or forced into early retirement, their ambitious plots dismantled in silent disgrace. Camilla understood with bitter clarity that her victory over the narrative had been an illusion. The long struggle to secure her place beside the king had culminated in an undeniable defeat, leaving her exposed as a peripheral figure in a house now governed by the legacy of her former rival. Yet, for the victors, there was no sense of triumph, only the crushing, fatalistic weight of a destiny fully realized. Prince William and Catherine stood together in the private gardens of Kensington Palace, looking out over the misty grounds as the reality of their new responsibility settled upon them. The historic Spencer crown now resided in a secure vault, no longer a hidden relic of grief, but an absolute symbol of an unshakable mandate. But carrying that mandate demanded an immense psychological toll. William had protected his wife and honored his mother, yet he had done so by breaking the spirit of his father, carrying the dark burden of knowing that his triumph was bought with the permanent rupture of familial innocence. Catherine, now recognized by all as the undisputed moral center of the monarchy, felt the suffocating pressure of an entire nation's expectations resting upon her shoulders. The machinery of the court quickly adapted to the new order, as it always does when power shifts decisively. The senior household staff, once loyal to the conservative instincts of the old reign, now deferred instinctively to the directives issuing from the office of the Prince and Princess of Wales. The proposed committee to oversee Catherine's duties was permanently dissolved, replaced by a strategic team dedicated exclusively to advancing her independent vision for the monarchy. The palace public relations apparatus was forced to accept a new doctrine. The era of suppressing internal truth for the sake of institutional appearance was over. The monarchy had survived its internal trial, not by burying its wounds, but by allowing the past to consume the present, forging a ruthless new reality where emotional integrity was defended with absolute force. In the final analysis, history will record this quiet coup not as a mere family dispute, but as the moment the House of Windsor surrendered to its own past. Kings build empires, draft laws, and erect monuments of stone. Yet the ultimate power in this ancient hall belonged to a mother's written wish, carried across decades by a devoted son, and guarded by a steadfast princess. The crown of state may still rest upon the sovereign's head, but the true pulse of the realm now beats within the hands of those who chose love over protocol and justice over silence. The cycle of suffering that had haunted the royal bloodline for generations had finally burned itself out, leaving a dark, majestic foundation upon which a modern dynasty would rise. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next breakdown.